Good morning and welcome to today's workshop on the ins and outs of CSI, TSI, and ATSI. I'm Adrienne Balcazar and I would like to introduce the LCAP-State and Federal Programs Unit. Joining us from the team today is Laurel Estrada, Augustine Garcia, Rachel Garcia, and Jeannie Keith. Also joining us is our support staff, April Grease and Susanna Mendoza. Joining us today, we're very happy to welcome the Accountability and Data Literacy Unit with Evan Bartelheim and Dr. Hilary Wiseman. So let's get started. But before we get started, let's take a quick minute to look at this geometry riddle. How many squares do you see? We'll give you a few seconds to kind of take a look at this. And if you know, place your answer in the chat. Ooh, such a wide range of answers. Well, okay. All right. Well, okay. So the answer is 40. And whether you solved it by counting each square or using an algebraic formula, or you simply just typed it in your phone and looked up the answer, there's many ways to get the answer. So just like the geometry riddle, there are many approaches that can be taken when addressing the comprehensive support and improvement. You can see there are so many squares within one large square, which can be much like how the requirements of CSI or ATSI, how they can overlap within existing processes that exist within your schools. I'll put in the chat the actual formula so you can see how to figure it out. Let's see. There you go. So that's one strategy. And then there's the additional squares that you would need to add to that, making it 40. Something to think about. All right, as we move on, to access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat, and this will take you directly to the slides, or you can use the link at the top of this slide and it'll take you to our Canvas page. The presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and resources available. Here is today's agenda. We will talk about the criteria for eligibility and exiting, the LEA's responsibility for supporting CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools, the DOS COP exemption waiver, and then also planning requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. We'll take a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment and root cause analysis. We'll also look at resource inequities and evidence-based interventions. And lastly, we'll talk about the maintaining documentation for CSI and ATSI schools for federal program monitoring. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box and we will answer any simple questions that we can, but we will follow up with written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to you. We are recording today's training and we will post this on our Canvas webpage. And now I'll turn it over to Evan, who will explain the criteria for eligibility and exiting.
Thanks, Adrienne. Yeah, we thought we'd get started. I love this quote from David Byrne from Talking Heads. And you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? So that's what we're going to try to explain, whether you're entering a new criteria or a new status or you're exiting, you want to know how you were exited. We're going to explain that now. If you could advance. Just a quick update. So the ESSA status for LA County has changed significantly over the last 3 years for the better, which is great. And you'll note that we had our highest category back in 2022 when we produced our first dashboard following the pandemic. We had nearly 1,400 schools identified for ATSI, 82 for CSI low graduation rate, and 58 for CSI low performing. Now we've shifted considerably. We've got 64 schools, only 64, down significantly from even last year, still eligible, meeting the criteria for ATSI, 57 for low graduation rate, and only 23 for low performing schools. So that's huge. We have the new category TSI, which we'll talk about in just a minute. 37 schools identified there, but almost 2,000 schools in LA County that have no status whatsoever. So that's excellent news. Next slide. Before we get started into the details, I just always want to share this great resource that our colleagues over at the San Bernardino Superintendent of Schools Office have shared with us. It's we call it the dashboard at a glance, and it gives you for the school level, which is particularly helpful for determining CSI or ATSI or helping to explain it to people. The ability to see all of your indicators for all your student groups at once, and we used it even for the identification of some samples within our presentation this morning. It actually includes 3 years worth of data, so you go back to 2022 if you so wished, and if you're a charter school, they have charters separated out as well. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is what drives the identification of schools, has several criteria and the eligibility categories that must be identified by the state for individual schools. And these are hierarchical, and they start with the identification of schools for CSI low graduation rate, followed by schools identified for CSI low performing schools, and then move to the additional targeted support and improvement category, and finally the targeted support and improvement category, and we're going to distinguish between those two in just a minute. So what really is new this year is that for the first time in 2023-24, we're able to finally catch up with what's supposed to be a 3-year cycle. So the determination of CSI low graduation rate, CSI low performing, and ATSI are only supposed to happen every 3 years. And the state was trying to get that timed with the LCAP 3-year cycle, and we just kept missing. And then we had a pandemic, and then they finally were able to do it and catch up with it. So we had that determination back in 23-24 based on the 23 dashboard. And that allows us to now identify TSI, which is that the targeted support and improvement. Why it's just targeted support and improvement, and why it's not additional, I'm not sure. But it is the in-between identification, right? So TSI is only identified in the 2024-25 school year, and then again in the 2025-26 school year. And then in 2026, we'll move back to identification for CSI, both categories, and ATSI. And TSI, the determinations are evaluated annually. CSI, ATSI, although it's a 3-year cycle, you can exit throughout the period. They re-evaluate each year. So we'll talk about what the X category are in the next few slides. So an important note I'd like to make here, at the January State Board of Education meeting, the board announced during an item about accountability that they would not be reopening the state's ESSA plan until after 2026. And that's fairly significant for a few reasons. Number one, it will kind of create this locked in stone view. So what the state's ESSA plan currently has in it is not going to change. And that includes things related to the specific indicators and how they're measured and how they're used. But more importantly, there's some new things and new changes to the dashboard that you probably are familiar with that weren't in the original state's ESSA plan, and they may change. They may be used for the identification for differentiated assistance for school districts, county offices, and charter schools, but they won't be used for the identification of schools for CSI, ATSI, or TSI. And you may even wonder, like, well, we have these student groups, why aren't they being identified? And that's because they weren't identified as part of the state's ESSA plan, and they're not going to be included, at least for a few years, until they decide to reopen it. So among the changes that happened at the dashboard that you'll notice, the addition of the long-term English learner student group, first of all, it's a new student group that was added to the dashboard in 2024. They wouldn't be identified this year anyway, because you have to have 2 years worth of data to meet it, but they won't be included moving forward. So your long-term English learner group would not be a factor in being identified for any of the ESSA eligibility criteria. Additionally, the science indicator, we expect by the next dashboard, they will have colors established. That will not be included in the identification for any of the ESSA categories. And finally, the ELA and math growth data, which is new this year, if the state board decides they want to use that for some form of accountability, it would only be for state accountability, not for federal accountability. So let's talk about the different categories and how you get in and out of them. CSI, low graduation rate being the first. As I mentioned, this is hierarchical. So the first thing they do when they're determining school eligibility is they look at low graduation rate. So of course you have to have grades 9 through 12 represented in your school to be identified. This is a category that's applied to both Title I and non-Title I funded schools. And it's based on a 3-year average that's below 68%. So for the most recent dashboard, a school would have had to have an average over the course of the 2022, 2023, and 2024 dashboards of the below 68%. And that's the combined graduation rate, which is 4th and 5th year graduation rate. That's the dashboard graduation rate. And you have to have had 30 or more students in the denominator for all 3 years to be eligible. So if you're a lot of our alternative schools, continuation schools, sometimes that graduation denominator may drop down below. So if at any point drops down below, it's kind of a reset, so you don't have the 3 years included. So it's pretty straightforward. How do you exit? You have to get that average 3-year average above 68%, and then you're no longer eligible for CSI low grad rate, but then you'd be subject to other criteria, other eligibility criteria. Next slide. The next category that is then identified after low graduation rate is the CSI lowest performing category. And this, like I mentioned earlier, was originally identified based on the 2023 dashboard. And that list will actually be maintained for 3 years, although you can exit it, right? So to be eligible, a school does have to have received Title I funding, and that was as of the 2022-23 school year. So that was when it was initially determined. So that was the year that was applied. And you had to be in the lowest performing minimum of 5%, according to the state. Now, the ESSA plan calls for no less than 5%. That doesn't mean they get to 5% and stop. It's however many criteria need to be applied to get them to at least 5%. So sometimes it's 6% of the schools or 7% of the schools. And so once they're identified on that, they cannot be identified for any other criteria. Next slide, please. So the initial identification for CSI lowest performing schools is important because it also applies to ATSI and TSI. So on the 2023 dashboard, the original determination was based on 3 different criterion. And the first one is all red indicators. And we're going to give samples of these in just a minute so you can actually see what this looks like. So if your school had all red indicators at the all students level, you would have been eligible for CSI lowest performing. The next criterion was all red indicators except for 1. And then the final one was any school that had 5 or more indicators where the majority of the indicators were red. And so the first criterion applied to schools that had at least 1 indicator, and that happened fairly frequently. They only had 1 indicator, that indicator was red, and you ended up in CSI low performing. For the second criterion, it applied to schools, you had to have a minimum of 2 or more indicators, meeting that N size of 30 students or more. So now how do you get out of CSI low performing? This actually happened, as we saw, a lot of our schools who are CSI low performing did exit this year. So there are basically 2 criteria for getting out of CSI low performing. The first is that you don't meet any of the criteria. So you're all students, just like we went over, you would have had to have changed that. At least one of your indicators would have had to move from red, let's say, to another color. The second criterion is that a school shows improvement in at least one of the state indicators for which they had the lowest performance color. And the reason this is significant, and this is the moving forward, if you exited this year, it would have been you had to have improved on the 2024 dashboard in one of the indicators from 2023. The reason this is significant is because you could actually have an instance where you have a student group changed in size, and so an indicator fell off of your criteria to be considered, and they don't want it to just be a matter of just a mathematical change. You actually have to show improvement, and the changes are pretty small. You had to move up 1/10 of a point for distance from standard if you're talking about ELA or math, or 1/10 of a percentage point for LP graduation rate improvement, or then suspension and chronic absenteeism, a decline of of 0.1%. So here are some examples that we just pulled randomly from the schools that are still eligible for CSI low performing. And you can see in the top one, this is a sample where you have all red indicators. And in this case, we had they didn't have enough students to actually get colors for ELA or math, and you can tell that on the dashboard because they have gray indicators. If they have between 11 and 29 students, they will show the status, they'll show the change, but they won't have a color. So that's how you could tell if an indicator was included in the consideration of eligibility. So in this case, they only had suspension rate and chronic absenteeism, both of which were red. That met the first criterion. In the second criterion, in the second sample here, you can see it was one of those examples where a school only had 2 indicators, one of which was red. And sometimes we've even seen one red and one blue, right? But the way the rules work, if you had one red and the other one was not, then you would be included. But this could also be the case where you had 3 indicators were red and one was a different color would be applied. And then in the final instance, you have to have a minimum of 5 with three of which, or the majority of which, are red. So that's what how that third criterion may look. So now we can talk about TSI and ATSI, and this is the one that we waited for a long time. There's really not a big difference between eligibility for targeted support improvement and additional targeted support improvement, other than the year in which they're determined, which I showed on that earlier table. So you are selected from among the schools that are not eligible for CSI low graduation rate or CSI low performing. And this year, several of the schools that were identified for TSI actually were coming out of, they'd exited CSI low performing and then were identified for TSI this year. Both Title I funded and non-Title I funded schools are included. They're eligible for TSI, ATSI. And you have to have 1 or more student groups that for 2 consecutive years meet the criteria applied to determine the lowest performing 5%. So that's where the CSI low performing, the same criterion are applied. They're applied at the student group level, and the student group has to have met it for 2 consecutive years. So just, it should look familiar here for TSI identification and ATSI continued identification. So if you met any of these criteria, again, it was a student group for 1 or more student groups for 2 consecutive years on the dashboard. They're applying the same eligibility criterion as CSI low performing. They had to have had the 30 or greater students for a student group to qualify. And it's at all red indicators, but 1 or 5 or more indicators, the majority of which are red. And it applies to all student groups with at least 1 indicator. So, and that's often the case where you have the only criteria or the only indicator may be suspension, because that tends to get a lot more students because of the business rules. And if that one were red, then you would be identified for this year TSI if it was the first year. Next slide. So here again, it's very similar criteria, some similar samples as the previous one. One thing you'll note is, in this case, the first criterion I just want to point out, you may see on your on the ELA and math on the first indicator, you see 34 and 33 students, and you're saying, well, that's 30 students. How did they not meet that? They wouldn't have had 30 students in the prior year, so that's how you would know. If they didn't have if they don't have a color, that probably means that they didn't meet the N value, the minimum N value for 2 consecutive years. Next slide. And so how do you get out of TSI or ATSI? Very similar to how you get out of the CSI low performing. First, you don't meet that criteria for next year. And as we saw, a lot of schools got out of ATSI this year because they no longer met the criteria that were presented, and you have to improve at least 1 state indicator by those same small standards. If a school was eligible for TSI or ATSI in the prior year, but did not have at least 1 state indicator meeting the N size of 30 or more or greater in the current year, the school will exit, right? So it can happen that you had a student group that was eligible in the prior year, but they're so small and they fluctuate from year to year that they don't meet it in a subsequent year. And that's another way a school could have exited. And I think we're handing off to Rachel.
Thank you, Evan. And good morning, everyone. So next, we're going to take a look at the LEA's responsibilities for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. So once a school is identified for CSI, the LEA is responsible for developing and implementing a plan for the school to improve student outcomes. And this must be done in partnership with educational partners, including the principal and other school leaders, teachers, and parents. Also, the plan must be approved by both the school and the LEA. Another important thing to note is that the CSI plan is required of all schools, regardless of whether or not the LEA receives CSI funds. And so the only exception to this is for those DOS community of practice schools that are eligible for CSI under the low graduation rate criteria and have less than 100 students and choose to forego implementation of CSI-related improvement activities. And we'll be taking a closer look at this exception in the next section of this presentation. And then lastly, LEAs with schools that meet the CSI criteria must complete the CSI prompts that are located within the plan summary section of the LCAP. And so here we see a screenshot of the 3 CSI prompts in the LCAP that LEAs with schools eligible for CSI must complete. And so this section, it only applies to LEAs with the school or schools identified for CSI based on the 2024 dashboard data. And so the focus of these CSI prompts is how the LEA is supporting the identified schools with the development, monitoring, and the evaluation of the 2025-26 CSI plan. And so for the first CSI prompt, LEAs will need to provide the names of the schools identified for CSI. In the second prompt, LEAs must describe how they have or will support the CSI school in developing their CSI plan, including how the LEA has or will support the CSI school with conducting a school-level needs assessment and data analysis, also identifying evidence-based interventions, and identifying any resource inequities to be addressed through the plan for the 25-26 school year. And then the last prompt asks for a description of how the LEA will monitor and evaluate both the implementation and the effectiveness of the CSI plan. And so if you have schools that were previously identified and continue to be eligible for CSI, the response should include the LEA's process for supporting the schools with plan development, implementation, and evaluation for the 25-26 school year. And for your reference, a link to the ESSA Assistant Status Data file, which includes the CSI, TSI, and ATSI school eligibility, is included at the bottom of the slide. So the CDE has developed guidance that county offices may use when reviewing and approving the CSI prompts. And this guidance includes considerations for LEAs to ensure a thorough response to the 3 prompts. And so you can access the CDE guidance at the link provided on the slide. And so for the first prompt, LEA should use the common, readily identifiable name for each school. Single school districts and charter schools may indicate not applicable for this prompt. For prompt 2, a thorough response would describe which educational partners were included in the process and also how the LEA used their feedback to develop the CSI plan. It should also include a description of the needs assessment process, the types of data and information used, and how it informed the development of the plan. Additionally, the response should describe how evidence-based interventions were identified and selected, how the LEA identified resource inequities, and how those resource inequities are being addressed through the CSI plan. And for prompt 3, a thorough response would include a description of the LEA's process for monitoring and evaluating, again, both the implementation and effectiveness of the plan. And so the response should include a description of the types of data the LEA is collecting and analyzing to monitor and evaluate both the implementation and effectiveness of the plan. And the response should also describe how educational partners are involved in this process. So next we have LEA responsibilities for TSI and ATSI schools. So when a school is identified for TSI or ATSI, the LEA is responsible for notifying the school that it has been identified for TSI or ATSI. And the notification must indicate which student groups in the school are consistently underperforming. So in other words, the student groups that led to the school's eligibility for TSI or ATSI. For ATSI, schools were identified for eligibility last year based on the 2023 dashboard, and as Evan mentioned, were reevaluated this year to determine if they met the exit criteria based on the 2024 dashboard. So for those schools that did not exit ATSI, the LEA would need to notify the schools of their continuing ATSI eligibility and include the student groups that led to this identification. So unlike CSI, the school is responsible for the development and the implementation of the TSI or ATSI plan, and not the LEA. However, keep in mind that the LEA is responsible for approving the plan and monitoring the implementation of the plan. Additionally, the LEA is required to take additional action if after a number of years, as determined by the LEA, the implementation of the plan is not successful. It's also important to note that there is no additional ESSA funding available for TSI and ATSI schools. The additional ESSA funding is only available for CSI schools. So we created a sample notification that LEAs can use to notify its schools of TSI eligibility. And so here you can see a screenshot of that sample, and we've also included it with today's materials. The highlighted areas in the sample letter are where you would enter the information specific to your school and district. And feel free to adapt the notification to meet your LEA's needs. The key thing to remember is that the notification must first inform the school that they have been identified for TSI, and then which student groups led to that identification. And so here we also have a sample notification for ATSI eligibility. And so again, LEAs can use this sample notification to inform its schools of continued eligibility for ATSI. And again, feel free to adapt the notification to meet your needs. And just like TSI, at a minimum, LEAs must inform the school of their eligibility and which student groups led to that identification. So next, we're going to review the Dashboard Alternative School Status, or DOS, flexibilities for CSI. So Dashboard Alternative School Status, or DOS, schools are alternative schools that serve high-risk students, including continuation, community day schools, opportunity schools, and juvenile court schools. There are several school types that automatically qualify as alternative status per Ed Code 52052D. And so these schools are automatically placed in the DOS program. There are other alternative schools that serve high-risk students, but not included in Education Code 52052D. And so these schools may apply for the DOS program if they meet the other alternative schools criteria. Additional information regarding DOS eligibility requirements, including application instructions for other alternative schools, can be found on the CDE website at the link provided on the slide. And so DOS schools can be eligible for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. DOS schools that meet eligibility criteria for CSI low graduation rate or CSI low performing based on the 2024 dashboard will continue to be referred to as DOS Community of Practice schools. And so LEAs can refer to the DOS column in the 2425 ESSA Assistant Status Data file for your DOS program status. So back in 2022, at its September State Board of Education meeting, the State Board granted approval for DOS COP schools identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria to implement differentiated improvement activities. And so these flexibilities, they continue to be available to LEAs with DOS COP schools eligible for CSI under low graduation rate. So under ESSA, the state may permit an LEA with a school that predominantly serves students returning to education after having exited secondary school without a regular high school diploma, or who, based on their grade or age, are significantly off track to accumulate sufficient credits to meet high school graduation requirements to participate in these differentiated improvement activities. And so the next slide provides an overview of the differentiated improvement activities that are available to these schools. So there are two differentiated improvement activity options that are available for DOS schools. And so the first differentiated improvement activity, it's available to any LEA that has a DOS COP school identified under CSI low graduation criteria with less than 100 enrolled students in the prior school year. This option allows the LEA to forego implementation of all CSI-related improvement activities for that specific school. And so LEAs that choose to exercise this flexibility do not have to develop or implement a CSI plan for its DOS COP school eligible under CSI low grad rate, again with less than 100 students, and also will forego the CSI funding associated with that school. So additionally, LEAs opting to exercise this option and forgo the implementation of CSI-related activities and the applicable funding needed to indicate its intent to do so through the application for funding in GMART that was due last month on March 3rd. Now, the second differentiated improvement activity is available to any LEA with a DOS COP school identified again under CSI low graduation rate, and this is regardless of the number of students enrolled. And so this option allows an LEA to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements. And so with this option, there would not be a separate CSI plan for the school, but instead the school's CSI plan would be embedded within the LEA's LCAP. So the next few slides address the CSI prompts for LEAs that choose to exercise the flexibilities that were just shared on the previous slide. And so this slide here applies to differentiated activity number 1. And so again, this would be for those LEAs that have a DOS COP school identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria with less than 100 enrolled students in the prior year, and who choose to forego the implementation of all CSI-related improvement activities. So for LEAs that choose this option, you would need to complete the first prompt in the CSI section with standardized language provided by the CDE that basically says you're choosing to forego the implementation of all CSI-related improvement activities and the applicable funding. And with this option, LEAs are not required to complete prompts 2 and 3. And you can find that standardized language that must be included in prompt 1 on the CDE website at the link provided. The next two slides apply to LEAs that choose to implement differentiated activity number 2. So for single school districts and direct funded charter schools with DOS COP schools eligible under CSI low graduation rate, regardless of the number of students enrolled, if you choose to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, you would not need to complete prompt 1 in the CSI section. However, you are still required to complete prompts 2 and 3. And for traditional LEAs with DOS COP schools identified under CSI low graduation rate, again, regardless of the number of students enrolled, that choose to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, you are required to complete all 3 prompts in the CSI section of the LCAP. So as mentioned, differentiated improvement activity number 2 allows any LEA with a DOS COP school identified under CSI low graduation rate the option to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements. So for LEAs that choose this option, as mentioned, a separate CSI plan is not required for the school. Instead, the CSI planning requirements must be embedded within the LEA's LCAP. And there are 5 CSI planning requirements that must be addressed. LEAs have the flexibility to determine how to address these CSI requirements within the LCAP as long as all 5 requirements are addressed somewhere in the plan. So to support LEAs with using the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, the CDE developed this CSI planning summary. And this planning summary, it provides examples of where the 5 CSI planning requirements may be addressed within the LCAP. So for example, for the first CSI planning requirement, the LEA may describe how it partnered with educational partners in the development of the CSI plan in prompts 2 and 3 of the CSI section in the plan summary, or in the engaging educational partners section. And you can access the CSI planning summary resource on the CDE website at the link provided. And so that concludes this section. I will now turn it over to Augustine.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. So in this section, we'll be going over the planning requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. Okay, so first, let's review the planning requirements for CSI. So as Rachel mentioned, the first step in CSI planning is that LEAs must collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a CSI plan. So the CSI plan must be informed by all state indicators, including student performance against state-determined long-term goals. So to do this, you want to start with the California School Dashboard to see why your school is eligible for CSI. Use it to identify key indicators, analyze trends, and prioritize focus areas for the CSI plan. The CSI plan must be based on a school-level needs assessment, so conduct a needs assessment for each CSI site, review the data and the needs of the school to assess the reasons why the school became eligible for CSI. The needs assessment may include a review of quantitative and qualitative data analysis, such as empathy interviews and observations. The needs assessment should eventually lead to a root cause analysis to help determine the underlying causes that led to CSI eligibility. The CSI plan must include evidence-based interventions, strategies, and activities that could be employed to address those needs. Evidence-based interventions are those practices and programs that have evidence to show that they are effective at producing results and improving student achievement outcomes. The CSI plan must identify resource inequities, which may also include a review of LEA and school-level budgeting and address those inequities throughout the plan. CSI plans for the 25-26 school year must be fully developed and approved at the local level. The plan should be ready to be implemented no later than the first day of the 25-26 school year. And this is to ensure a full year of support consistent with the LEA CSI plan for that school. So for TSI, upon notification of CSI status by the LEA, the school is required to collaborate with ed partners to develop and implement a school-level plan to improve outcomes for each subgroup of students that cause the school to be identified for TSI. The school plan must adhere to the following requirements. It is to be informed by all state indicators on the California School Dashboard and include evidence-based interventions. Again, the 25-26 TSI plans must be approved at the local level, school and LEA, and should be ready to implement no later than the first day of the 25-26 school year. So for ATSI, upon notification of ATSI status by the LEA, the school is required to collaborate with ed partners again to develop and implement a school-level plan to improve outcomes for each subgroup of students that cause the school to be identified for ATSI. The ATSI school plan must adhere to the following requirements. So again, it's to be informed by all state indicators on the California School Dashboard, include evidence-based interventions, and also identify resource inequities at the school and LEA level. And it bears repeating, the 25-26 ATSI plans must be approved at the local level, and they should be ready to be implemented no later than the first day of the 25-26 school year. Okay, so now let's review the three options that LEAs have to support their schools in CSI, TSI, and ATSI planning. Option number one is using the templates provided by the CDE. So the CDE has developed SPSA templates that, if completed consistent with the provided instructions, and of course implemented with fidelity, well, they meet all the CSI, TSI, and ATSI planning requirements. We want to again highlight the importance of adhering to the accompanying instructions to ensure compliance with federal program planning requirements. The links to the three templates are included on this slide for your reference. Planning option number two is for our friends in single school districts and charter schools. So Ed Code sections 64001 through 65001 allow single school districts and charter schools to utilize their LCAP to serve as the SPSA to meet its CSI, TSI, and ATSI planning requirements. And finally, option number three is that a school may elect to use its own planning document or template. However, this template must address all federal planning requirements for TSI, CSI, and ATSI. So now I'll hand it off to Dr. Wiseman, who will be covering comprehensive needs assessment and root cause analysis.
Thank you, Augustine, and good morning and happy Thursday, everyone. Let's take a moment and look at the next few slides and review some components associated with a needs assessment and the significance root cause analysis plays in understanding the why behind student outcomes. So as we know, and just for review, a needs assessment is a systemic process used to identify and analyze the gaps between current educational conditions and desired outcomes. It helps to understand the specific needs of students, teachers, and the site-level school system as a whole. Conducting a needs assessment ensures that resources are allocated effectively and that interventions are targeted to address the most critical areas for improvement. Additionally, and probably most importantly, a needs assessment supports organization and communication around data collection and analysis, collaboration among various educational partners, and is an ongoing system for continuous improvement. The California School Dashboard, along with its additional reports sections, function as a strategic high-level needs assessment tool. And as Augustine stated in previous slides, it offers a starting point for data gathering and deeper analysis. Despite not identifying root causes of improvement areas, it does equip staff and educational partners with essential data literacy skills, emphasizing both overall student performance and the disaggregation of data to highlight equity gaps and prioritize support for student groups with greater needs. Once data from the California dashboard has been collected and analysis begins, the next step is to take a closer look at the causation of potential disproportionality and challenges among student groups and student programs within the data. This means going beyond the dashboard to conduct a more detailed investigation that helps to better understand the factors contributing to these challenges. While uncovering root causes will come later, this deeper analysis is essential for laying the foundation of a needs assessment. It provides a clear structure for gathering additional data and refining a focus, allowing for more targeted questions to be asked that will eventually guide the root cause analysis. So, what are the steps in a needs assessment? As we said before, a needs assessment follows a systemic approach to identifying and addressing student needs as part of a continuous improvement cycle. It begins by organizing foundational data points, such as student demographics and student performance or outcomes from the dashboard. This data is then reviewed and analyzed, with findings compiled into an accessible format to guide deeper exploration. Typically, these are explored through the lenses of trends or year-to-year comparisons to gain a better sense of student outcomes over time. Next, qualitative data, such as surveys and educational partner feedback, is gathered to complement existing information, enabling a comprehensive analysis that identifies key discoveries and actionable priorities. These insights are summarized to inform the development of targeted plans aimed at improving student outcomes. And finally, this process incorporates reflection, adjustment, and annual repetition to ensure ongoing refinement and responsiveness to evolving needs, reinforcing its role as an integrated and dynamic tool for equity-driven improvement. On this slide, as an optional resource, a needs assessment template has been provided. It's flexible, it's intended to support your planning requirements, it houses evidence, and captures work done amongst various educational audiences. Make sure at the bottom there to click the CDE link as well, as that will provide you a wealth of resources from webinars to step-by-step worksheets and toolkits, all focused on elevating voices and building capacity. So, at the heart of the fourth step of the needs assessment is the root cause analysis, a critical strategy for uncovering and understanding challenges related to student outcomes, equity gaps, or school performance. For example, while tools like the dashboard highlight symptoms such as low graduation rate or disparity in test scores, a root cause analysis digs deeper to identify the systemic or environmental factors driving those results, such as inadequate access to resources, ineffective instructional practices, or barriers to student engagement. In this diagram, you can see the root cause transpires within the fourth step of a needs assessment, where student outcomes and qualitative data such as surveys, student focus groups, and or LCAP groups come together. The significance of root cause analysis lies in its ability to understand and thus more appropriately address problems at their source. By focusing on the root causes rather than surface level symptoms, educational partners are able to develop targeted strategies that eliminate wasted effort, conserve resources, and create sustainable solutions that lead to meaningful improvements in student outcomes and school effectiveness. As we move to the next slide, and to end this section, we provided you some resources and tools offered by the CDE, starting with the dashboard for all your data needs, then moving to the continuous improvement resource webpage for their needs assessment guidebook, and a very useful webinar, albeit long, very, very informative. We've also included some valuable improvement science tools, most commonly leveraged protocols when exploring data. And lastly, there are several diagrams and protocols used to support and conduct root cause analysis. Regardless of the tool that you're going to use, it's critical to take the time to analyze, synthesize, prioritize, and summarize that data and slow down before jumping to solutionitis. And this concludes the section, and I'll hand it over to Laurel.
Thank you, Hillary. And so now we're going to talk about resource inequities, which flows naturally from a discussion on needs analysis and root cause analysis. So when a school is eligible for CSI or ATSI, they are to use their needs assessment and data analysis to identify and describe any resource inequities. Data from your needs assessment will point to disparities between student groups, which are signs of potential resource inequities. Consideration of resource inequities can inform assessment of the effectiveness of actions and provide a basis for establishing goals or expected outcomes for specific student groups. There is no requirement to address resource inequities in the LCAP other than when describing how the LEA supported the CSI school or schools, as Rachel described earlier. If a single school LEA uses its LCAP to meet the school planning requirements for CSI and ATSI, the resource inequities must be identified there. And remember that the requirement to identify resource inequities applies to CSI and ATSI, but not to TSI. The link on this slide takes you to CDE resources related to identifying resource inequities, which we'll go over in a little more depth. This slide provides an overview of the program requirements for CSI and ATSI schools. The identification of resource inequities is a requirement for all schools identified for those two status. Additionally, for schools in CSI, The LEA is also required to support the schools in the process of developing the school plan. The CSI plan description is also required in the LEA's LCAP. So why examine inequity? Gaps between student groups can reveal potential symptoms of resource inequity. When there's disproportionate representation of one student group with high rates of dropouts, attendance, discipline, or achievement issues, schools are compelled to review the factors contributing to those disparities. Since students with greater needs require greater resources, providing equal resources or giving all students the same supports means that the system has resulted in resource inequities. Equal services inevitably yield inequitable support. High-quality learning experiences for all students is what we call education resource equity. When educational decisions are made based on the assumption that all students have the same needs, inequities can arise that disproportionately impact underrepresented populations. Education resource equity helps make sure that schools unlock every child's potential and that race and family income no longer predict outcomes. In considering resource inequities, it's important to begin with an understanding of what resource inequity is. This definition comes from a Jonathan Travers study published through Educational Resource Services, which examines numerous studies on the subject. Based on this definition, a review of resource inequities is not only about the allocation of funds to the school, it's about the allocation and use of resources. Beyond the dollars allocated, it's also people and time used to create equitable learning experiences for all students. Now that we've defined resource inequity and gone over why it is important to examine, we'll take a look at how those inequities might look in a school or LEA. This might involve lower quality books and materials, which could diminish the relevance of teaching and learning for students. Less access to technology could limit students' ability to engage in hands-on learning. That could limit the development of crucial technological skills. Another sign of inequity is larger class sizes or having less qualified or inexperienced teachers, which can negatively impact the personalized attention and instructional quality that students receive. Additionally, there may be inconsistencies in the application of effective instructional strategies and practices, leaving some students without the tailored support they need to thrive. Identifying resource inequities is crucial for addressing disparities and ultimately achieving true equity in classroom support. So how is this accomplished? There are numerous tools that can be used to identify resource inequities. On this slide, you can see that the CDE provides a variety of resources to support equity efforts. Although the state doesn't prescribe a specific approach, these resources offer valuable guidance. Today, I'll highlight the dimensions of equity available on this website, which serve as a framework for fostering more equitable school environments. The web page is included on this slide, and this is under the Resource Equity tab, which has a star. If you attended our SIPSA workshop earlier this year, we shared a resource that provides a framework for identifying potential resource inequities based on these dimensions. This is a framework for districts and schools to use going through the process of reviewing potential resource inequities. Jonathan Travers, as I mentioned, explored 11 dimensions of resource equity and developed a set of diagnostic questions that can help systems self-assess. He classified dimensions 1 through 7 as factors that directly impact the student experience and 8 through 11 as indirect impacts. The 7 factors that directly impact student experiences include teacher quality, early intervention, and family academic engagement. The factors that indirectly impact student experiences are also listed on this slide. So this is a handout adapted from Travers' work. It takes each of the dimensions of resource equity and poses a set of questions to help districts or schools self-assess their current system. It is available on our Canvas page, and a link is provided in this slide. One process to support identification of resource inequities is included here. It starts with a thorough data analysis to identify at least one indicator that needs greater attention, then determine which dimension or dimensions are most impacted and connected to this area. Teams can then work together to create a deeper understanding of that source of inequity and support evidence-based interventions to address it. This work would then be summarized in the school's CSI or ATSI plan. Let's take a look at a few scenarios in the next few slides. Here's a district-wide scenario. Awesome School is situated in an affluent neighborhood benefiting from generous outside funding. A parent foundation supports facilities and there are highly involved parents. On the other hand, Fabulous Elementary is located in a less affluent area, struggling with limited resources, limited space availability, and less parental involvement. Take a moment to read this chart. Okay. Considering this scenario and in the context of people, time, and money, which dimension or dimensions are most impacted or connected to this area? Take a moment to review the dimension in the yellow box and place it in the chat. There are several dimensions that could potentially be addressed in this scenario. Okay, well, once your team has analyzed the data and your LEA's unique circumstances, you can use this handout to ask some questions that facilitate a deep dive into resource inequities. Using our sample scenario, you might have chosen family academic achievement. As we consider that scenario, these questions may help the Fabulous Elementary School team engage in meaningful reflection on resource inequities within that identified dimension. As teams delve into meaningful conversation, it becomes increasingly apparent that resource inequities exist, prompting candid conversations to propel change in the direction of equity. Let's take a look at another scenario for identifying resource inequities within a school site for school leaders and educational partners. In the 8th grade at Excellent Middle School, EL students face distinct challenges that result in lower academic performance, higher rates of chronic absenteeism, and suspension. These issues arise from a combination of factors. The EL class is notably larger than others, which strains the teacher's capacity to provide personalized work. And the teacher is new to the field and lacks in-depth training for teaching EL students. Additionally, some EL students demonstrate behavioral problems stemming from language barriers and academic struggles, resulting in higher suspension rates and further hindering their educational and social progress. Take a moment and review the dimensions in the light yellow box. Which dimension or dimensions are most impacted or connected to this area? And if you'd like, you can place it in the chat. So you might have chosen teaching quality. In the next slide, there are possible questions the excellent middle school staff might use to dig deeper into this dimension. So these diagnostic questions specifically relate to the teacher quality dimension. What reliable measures of teacher effectiveness are in place? If there is a measure, how are highly effective teachers distributed across classrooms and among students with varying needs? Is equitable access to teaching, excellent teaching extended to high need students to a greater extent than to their low need counterparts, or vice versa? These inquiries inform decisions and implications for the school, its teaching staff, and their impact on fostering equity among students. Therefore, discussions that take into account considerations concerning personnel, time, and financial investments can lead to greater resource equity. These are additional questions that can support engaging in meaningful conversations about the local context of resource equity that includes the allocation, of course, of people, time, and money to create experiences that enable all students to reach rigorous learning outcomes, no matter their home circumstances. This slide lists ways in which LEA educational leaders might support school sites to conduct the work of identifying and addressing resource inequities. This includes connecting the needs assessment and identification of potential areas impacted by equity issues. LEAs might facilitate access to LEA level data and provide comprehensive support in data collection. LEAs might offer support, expert assistance in generating reports and conducting analysis, highlighting strengths and gaps, summarizing trends, and interpreting findings to guide the focus on resource inequities in alignment with district or school priorities. LEA's support might involve assisting in formulating diagnostic questions and reviewing evidence-based strategies to effectively respond to identified needs. Along with the resources we have already shared, these are additional resources to support your efforts. They're all intended to drive proactive efforts to promote resource equity. Finally, I just want to remind you that the identification of resource inequities is required for CSI and ATSI schools, but not for TSI schools. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeannie for evidence-based interventions.
Thanks so much, Laurel, and good morning, everyone. In this next section, I'll share some criteria for what qualifies as evidence-based interventions, and we'll review some information about how they're identified and share where you can find some evidence-based interventions that connect to your student needs. So our slide here offers a process flowchart, and it really provides a recap of our learning today. And it also includes evidence-based interventions. And so now that you've taken stock of the most pressing issue and situation that you need to improve, your LEA or school is ready to research, identify, and select evidence-based interventions to implement, that you will implement so that you can achieve improved outcomes for specific student groups. So what are evidence-based interventions? The Every Student Succeeds Act defines evidence-based interventions as an approach that has evidence to show the project components are proven to be effective and are leading to desired outcomes, specifically increasing student achievement when implemented with fidelity. The intervention that targets a need and produces a desired outcome for the students in your school or LEA may be a strategy, a practice, or a program, and it may be included in a policy. So when selecting an intervention, an evidence-based intervention for your identified problem of practice or area of improvement, it's essential to keep in mind that it must have a proven track record through studies and findings that demonstrate the following components. It has evidence to show that it is effective in leading to desired and improved outcomes for student achievement. So here we're taking a look at Section 1801 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this defines the distinction between evidence-based strategies that have been proven to have statistically significant effects on improving student achievement and those that demonstrate a rationale or likelihood based on research to date to impact student achievement. These criteria are reflected in the 4 tiers of evidence. Let's take a look at these 4 tiers. In each of the tiers, the evidence has been produced through formal studies and research. And depending on the type of study, a specific level of evidence is produced. And so the tiers are distinguished as such. Tier 1 is strong evidence, Tier 2 moderate, Tier 3 promising evidence, and Tier 4 demonstrates a rationale. The ESSA tiers of evidence provide districts and schools with a framework for determining which programs, practices, strategies, and interventions work and in which context and for which students. If your school is identified for CSI, ESSA requires that interventions implemented have strong, moderate, or promising evidence. In other words, CSI interventions must be Tier 1, 2, or 3. So let's take a look at the tiers of evidence and how their ratings are determined by research study criteria. The more controlled the experiment in the research study of an intervention, along with the effect size or significant positive effect on the outcome, increases the strength of the evidence and thus determines its tier. The 5 factors that determine an intervention's evidence rating are included on the slide. These include study design, the results of a study, findings from related studies, sample size and setting, and lastly, its match, or how the students and the setting in the study match up with those in your district or school. So the use of the 5 factors allows for the systematic study of interventions and allows for them to be categorized based on the evidence into the tiers. So we'll talk a little bit about the criteria. Tier 1 with strong evidence is the highest level of available evidence. For an intervention to qualify in this tier, there must have been a well-designed and fully implemented experimental study with at least 350 participants in more than one district or school that produced a statistically significant positive effect on a relevant outcome. This means a randomized controlled experiment occurred with a treatment group that received the intervention and a control or comparison group that did not receive the intervention. Tier 2, moderate evidence. These interventions must have had at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study to support it. A control experiment with a treatment group was conducted. There was a group that received the intervention and a control group that did not. Participants in these groups are not randomly assigned. So the comparison group might not take into account the impact of factors such as socioeconomic status, gender, or self-selection to not participate. So while there may be a group to compare, it may not be as comparable as a group created through random assignment. Okay, Tier 3, promising evidence. These interventions must have had at least one well-designed and well-implemented correlational study. A study, not an experiment, took place to determine if a relationship existed between the intervention and a given outcome. This is usually done through data collection and analysis within the correlational study. The intervention must have shown statistically significant effects on the student or other relevant outcome, which means that the researchers found that the effects of the intervention were noteworthy and directly related to the intervention. The outcome was not the result of chance or any other input. So intervention led to a favorable result, such as increasing student achievement. Okay, so the last tier is tier 4. This involves interventions that demonstrate a rationale. These interventions have a clear and effective logic model or a theory of action that explains how the intervention is likely to improve relevant outcomes. They are supported by research, and there is an effort in place by the state, the district, the school, or an outside research organization to determine their effectiveness. So on the next slide, we're going to take a look at a chart, and this helps us to understand the ESSA tier of evidence defined by those 5 factors. And so with the chart, it's just another approach that might be easier to see what distinguishes or what qualifies an intervention into a particular tier. At a glance, you can see that the study design definitely plays a critical role in determining which tier of evidence an intervention falls. And luckily, schools and LEAs are not necessarily expected to conduct a study of interventions and determine its evidence rating. LEAs and schools are specifically tasked, however, with selecting and implementing an evidence-based intervention, practice, activity, or program that has already been identified within a tier to improve their students' needs. The purpose behind selecting interventions that have evidence to support their effectiveness is understandable, responsible, and requires for schools who find themselves identified in CSI, ATSI, or TSI. It is an opportunity for schools identified to be as strategic as possible in selecting and implementing interventions that have proven to be effective. Let's go on to the next slide. And so we also wanted to provide some guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that's included on the slide. And this recommends a step-by-step process for choosing and implementing evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions that improve outcomes for students and help LEAs, schools, and educational partners understand the 4 levels of evidence. The non-regulatory guidance included on the slide is called Using Evidence to Strengthen Education Investments. And this refers to evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions, and collectively refers to them as project components. Part 1 of the guidance reviews the steps necessary for effective decision-making about evidence used to address improved outcomes. Step 1 in the process is to engage in meaningful consultation with a broad range of educational partners to examine relevant data, to understand the most pressing needs of students, schools, educators, and potential root causes of those needs. Then in step 2, following this initial step, the LEA is ready to support identified schools through the process of considering and then selecting the most promising and relevant evidence-based project components that have evidence of effectiveness for their local setting, while always considering the local district and school level resources. Learning about and using evidence is a key component for step 2. Questions to consider when selecting relevant evidence-based project components are offered in step 2. As part of selecting project components, schools will need support so they can consider costs of implementation, staffing requirements, professional development planning, and how components would fit into the context of the local educational setting. Other considerations may include a discussion whether the project components will be classroom-focused, student-focused, or implemented school-wide. Once your LEA has identified evidence-based components that support the area of improvement, has reviewed and discussed their relevance to your setting and contexts, its likelihood of implementation with fidelity, you're ready to finally select one of the evidence-based components. As an LEA in school, you're then ready for step 3. This is then to develop a plan for implementation of the selected activities, strategies, or interventions that are applicable. Then, beginning with the 25-26 school year, steps 4 and 5, the district supports schools with implementation and continuously progress monitoring through reflection of implementation and outcomes. Part 2 of the resource provides definitions of the meanings of evidence-based, which we have already discussed in this presentation. And so using, generating, and sharing evidence about effective strategies to support learners of all ages gives educational partners an important tool to improve their academic and non-academic outcomes for all students and specific student groups and educational settings. The department emphasizes the use of evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions in the design of education programs from pre-K through adult ed. And so this slide offers multiple resources that include evidence-based interventions that an LEA may consider to address their local needs. There are databases that provide ratings for evidence-based programs and practices, such as Evidence for ESSA database through Johns Hopkins University Center for Research and Reform in Education. This is the CRRE, as well as the What Works Clearinghouse, or the WWC, which is an initiative of the Institute of Education Sciences through the U.S. Department of Education. Additionally, from the U.S. Department of Education is the document called Using Evidence to Create Next Generation High Schools. This resource highlights 6 general evidence-based strategies to improve America's high schools. These strategies address practices that engage students and help prepare them for college and career success. Though many of the effective strategies may share common features, each has been identified in the research literature as a standalone intervention or model for improving students' educational outcomes. The strategies reviewed for enhancing students' high school and college outcomes include participation in rigorous curriculum. Number 2, small learning communities or small schools of choice. Number 3, career academies. Number 4, dual enrollment. Number 5, early college high schools. And number 6, college and career counseling. The Evidence-Based Improvement Guide, also included on the slide from WestEd, offers some tools to support LEAs with engaging schools and their educational partners to understand their needs and select and support implementation of relevant evidence-based interventions. Also included is the IRIS Center, which provides research summaries of evidence-based instructional strategies and interventions. And additionally, the last two are CDE websites that include many resources and a section with links to multiple resources for continuous improvement. So we'll take a quick look at some types of resources offered on the WWC website. Here it provides practice guides that highlight particular evidence-based strategies and their tiered level of evidence, as well as intervention reports that provide tiered levels of evidence for specific programs or studies that have been reviewed. The practice guides. These guides share evidence of specific strategies and expert guidance from panels of experts in the field with experience related to the topic of study. The Institute of Education Sciences publishes practice guides to provide educators with the best available evidence and expertise on current challenges in education. WWC develops practice guides in conjunction with an expert panel by combining the panel's expertise with the findings of rigorous research to provide specific recommendations for addressing education-related challenges. The WWC and the panel rate the strength of research evidence supporting each of their recommendations. On this slide, you'll see 3 guides are offered. The first addresses recommendations for providing reading intervention in grades 4 through 9. The second addresses assisting struggling students in math in elementary grades. And the third addresses strategies to prevent dropouts in secondary schools. These guides offer evidence-based recommendations or strategies that may not be readily solved within a single program. The guide synthesizes the best publicly available research and shares practices that are supported by evidence. They are intended to be practical and easy for teachers and school leaders to use. So, additionally, on the site, users can search for relevant practice guides using multiple filters, such as publication dates, topic areas, addressing, for example, specific academic areas or social emotional learning, grade levels, and specific populations served. On this next slide, we'll see a sample of the reviews of specific intervention programs. And here, this sample is a review about Read 180's intervention program. You can see it includes levels of evidence that connect to specific literacy outcomes and provides a summary of the research settings in which the research was conducted. Additionally, more specific details about program information and costs are included for specific intervention reviews. Another option that seems relevant today is AI. And AI might be a starting point for considering evidence-based interventions. You may, for example, be seeking to understand what evidence is available for interventions that support reading achievement for English learners at middle school. And you might pose a question to AI or to Rosie. Following AI's response, it's recommended to inquire about the tiers of evidence and their source, and then to check the facts to verify the project components and related evidence offered through AI. So we'll conclude our section on evidence-based resources with a slide about the LEA support role. And so this slide offers some considerations for how LEAs might support their eligible schools with the process of reviewing and identifying evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions to support improved outcomes. For considerations are some supports that an LEA may provide to assist schools address their CSI, ATSI, or TSI eligibilities. For example, LEAs can advise schools through the review and selection of evidence-based project components. While we know there are multiple resources and levels of research to consider, time to focus on research that is relevant to a school site can be overwhelming. Helping school leadership teams to access relevant studies that are based on similar school settings and with similar school populations will help them to focus their time on learning about specific studies that have shown high levels of effectiveness. Additionally, it's important that district leaders help schools connect the strategies, activities, or interventions that they are considering to existing district goals, actions, and policies, so the team can see how the supports work together to support student outcomes. And additionally, LEA leadership might consider assisting leadership teams to develop and implement a process for monitoring implementation and using outcome data to determine program impact. Schools can really benefit from district support that provides for timely and ongoing collection and reflection of student data to inform effectiveness. And now our program will transition to connecting our learning from today to the federal program monitoring process.
Thank you, Jeannie. Well, good morning, everyone. And looking at the time, it's 11:27, so I know we're supposed to end at 11:30, but we won't. But just know that if you need to leave, we understand. We will be putting the evaluation in the chat for those of you that need to leave, but we are recording, so you can always check back later if you need to leave. But we do encourage you to stay for this last bit. So looking at, we're going to take a look at the documentation that's needed if your schools are identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. If you are selected for an FPM review, the School Support and Improvement Program instrument is used. It's often referred to as SSI, FPM instrument. And the SSI instrument applies only to schools that are identified for CSI, ATSI, and TSI. There are 6 items in the SSI instrument. SSI 1 reviews the school site activities for all schools that have been identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. SSI items 2 through 6 apply only to LEAs who have accepted the CSI funds. And the items for review for the CSI funds are basically the same fiscal items that are reviewed for other federal programs. They are allocations and reporting, allowable use of funds, supplement not supplant, LEA administrative charges, time and effort, and lastly, LEA equipment inventory. So let's take a look at SSI 1, which is school site activities. And this item pertains to all schools that have been identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. There are 6 different components to item 1 in the school site activities. 1.0 pertains to schools in CSI, and it requires the LEA for each school, CSI school, to locally develop and implement a CSI plan. And also it must be done in partnership with educational partners, meaning the principal and other school leaders, teachers, parents, and family members. The CSI plan, as shared earlier, must be informed by all indicators, include evidence-based interventions, be based on school level assessment, identify resource inequities, and be approved by the school, the LEA, and the state, which again would be through our county office. 1.1 and 1.2 are for schools identified for TSI. 1.1 refers to the requirement that the LEA must formally notify the school that has been identified for TSI, and this notification must include the student subgroups that have consistently been underperforming. 1.2 gives the specific instructions and requirements for the school level TSI plan that is developed in partnership with the educational partners. But the TSI plan must be informed by all indicators, including student performance, along with the long-term goals, include evidence-based interventions, be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, and be monitored by the LEA. 1.3 addresses ATSI schools. So if you have schools that have been are still under ATSI, the LEA must also formally notify the school that they have been identified or continuously identified with the inclusion of the student groups that are consistently underperforming. And the components of the ATSI plan are the same as the others with the as the TSI. However, the identifying resource inequities is an added component to the requirement. 1.4 applies to CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. And this is the requirement that if the school has a SIPSA, the SIPSA may serve as a school improvement plan as long as the SIPSA meets all the federal requirements. And it also allows for the single site school districts and charter schools to use their LCAP as their SIPSA, provided again that the LCAP meets the federal school planning requirements and that their educational partner requirements and is adopted at a public hearing. Now, during an FPM review, the requested evidence of the school site activities are a copy of the LEA notification to schools for TSI and ATSI, a copy of the school improvement plan for CSI, TSI, and ATSI, or the SIPSA. And then the last requested evidence is documentation showing the involvement of the educational partners in the development of the plan, such as records of agendas, meeting minutes, attendance sign-in sheets, etc. The next two slides are the requirements for LEAs who have accepted the ESSA CSI funds. So SSI 2 reviews the allocation and reporting. So the LEA must just disperse the CSI funds in accordance with the approved CSI funding plan that's in the GMART. So there has to be congruence. In SSI 3, this is referring to the allowability of the use of funds. And here, during a review, they make sure that the costs are reasonable, necessary, and allocable. The funds must also be used for the development of strategies to improve pupil performance only at CSI schools. And these strategies must be aligned to the LCAP. It also should be noted that CSI funds cannot be used to hire additional permanent staff. SSI 4 reviews supplement, not supplant. And this is to make sure that each school it serves receives all of the state and local funds it would have received in the absence of school improvement funds. The other requirement is that LEAs must show the methodology that was used to allocate the state and local funds to any schools receiving the CSI funds. SSI 5 reviews the LEA's administrative charges, specifically with time and effort. The LEA must show how they properly charged and documented the allowable salary and wages that are in accordance with the CSI program requirements. And the last item reviewed is the SSI 6, which is the equipment inventory. And here it requires the LEA to maintain a historical inventory record for any piece of equipment. And also that it describes, that list describes A through M of all those requirements that are noted in the actual instrument. Also, CS 6.1, 2, and 3 go over the specifics in terms of what is necessary to be included, as well as how do you properly dispose of any equipment that was purchased with CSI funds, and then the physical inventory of the property that must take place at least every 2 years. So again, this is no different than previous other instruments in the equipment inventory. Here are some findings from current FPM reviews that have taken place. In SSI 1, there was the ATSI schools were not notified of their support status. Also, there was no school improvement plan in place for the schools eligible for additional for ATSI. Also, for SSI 2, 3, and 5 on the next slide, we have for SSI 2, the CSI expenditures were not aligned to what was identified as the root cause, or it was not dispersed in alignment with the funding plan that was submitted in GMART. So again, there has to be some revisions, budget revisions done if you are changing from what you have submitted originally to CDE. For SSI 3, it was found that CSI funds were used to benefit non-CSI schools. So again, they cannot do that. And then SSI 5, there was a lack of time and effort documentation for a CSI funded employee. And then another finding in SS5 was that the time and effort procedures and internal controls were not followed. So they may have had the time and effort procedures, but there was no evidence showing that they followed them. And so as a result of this, the following reimbursements were required to be made. So in SSI 3, because the CSI funds were used for district-wide activities that benefited a non-CSI schools, the funds had to be reimbursed. Also in SSI 5, CSI funds also had to be reimbursed because the funds were used for employees who spent time on unallowable activities. So again, making sure that you have those alignments. And lastly, here are some reminders that we want to leave you with. Again, for SSI 1, ensure that the CSI plan demonstrates the alignment between the identified root causes, the strategies, and the expenditures to be funded with CSI funds. For the SSI 2, if adjustments are made to how the funds will be distributed, ensure that these adjustments are made to the funding plan in the GMART. There must be alignment. For SSI 3, ensure that the CSI funds, including those reserved for at the district level, are only used to benefit CSI eligible schools. Funds may not be expended district-wide at non-CSI eligible schools. And for SSI 6, ensure that the equipment purchased with CSI funds are included in your historical inventory, as well as part of your 2-year process of reconciling it. And lastly, here are some FPM reminders specifically about time and effort. SSI 3, ensure any positions that are funded with CSI funds are temporary. For SSI 5, make sure you keep your time and effort records for any CSI funded positions. And again, these positions require the same documentation as other federally funded positions. And lastly, your time and effort procedures should include all the processes of tracking employee time, including that extra time that is funded with CSI funds. Last, we have a reminder. We want to remind you about the 3-part series for district and school leadership on the CSI and the school improvement plans. It will be starting today, given by our friends at the Center for District Capacity Building Unit. And here's the information in case you haven't seen it. But again, we want to encourage you to have not only the support at the district level, but also at the school level in terms of your CSI. And so again, we want to thank you for joining us today. Please complete the evaluation for today's meeting. And any last minute questions in the chat, please put them in there and we will be emailing you a Q&A answering all your questions. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that this is beneficial for you and that we will be posting this so you can go back to it in the future if you have any last minute questions or need to remind yourself about something you heard today. Thank you very much. Have a great